It was 11 o'clock on a Friday morning in late February 2026. The sky over the east side of Albuquerque, New Mexico, was pale blue and cold, the kind of quiet winter morning that doesn't demand your attention. A retired two-star general stepped out, or simply ceased to be visible, somewhere near a residential street not far from a base he had once helped run. No one saw where he went. No one knew what he was wearing. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, he had already been gone long enough that the trail, if there was one, had gone completely cold. His name, for the purposes of this story, is Richard Calloway, a decorated officer, a scientist, a man who spent decades inside some of the most classified research programs the United States military has ever funded. And now he was gone, just gone, on an ordinary Friday morning, without a word. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To understand what makes Richard Calloway's disappearance so difficult to accept at face value, you have to first understand the man himself. Not the headline version, not the missing person alert, but the actual shape of his life. Because the thing about Richard Calloway wasn't just that he was accomplished. It's that the specific nature of what he did, the programs he ran, the facilities he oversaw, the research he commanded, placed him in a very narrow category of people. A category that, by design, almost nobody knows anything about. Richard Calloway grew up in a modest household in the Midwest. He was the kind of kid who took apart radios to see how they worked and actually put them back together correctly. He went to a military academy, graduated with a degree in engineering, and then spent the next several years earning advanced degrees at one of the most prestigious technical universities in the country. His doctoral research was in astronautical engineering, which is not, in plain terms, a field that many people pursue. It is the engineering of objects and systems that operate in space. Propulsion, orbital mechanics, the physics of things that fly very fast through very thin air or no air at all. He was, by every account available, serious, methodical, the kind of person who did not speculate, who did not exaggerate, who did not invite drama. People who worked with him described him as calm under pressure, precise in his language, and deeply committed to what he believed was important work. That word, important, comes up more than once. He rose steadily through the ranks of the Air Force over a career that spanned more than 3 decades. He held positions of increasing responsibility in space research, acquisitions, and what the military calls operations. He worked within the National Reconnaissance Office, the agency responsible for operating the nation's spy satellites. He eventually commanded the Phillips Research Site at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, which is one of the primary locations where directed energy research takes place in this country. Lasers, high-powered microwave systems, the kind of technology that, if you described it to most people, would sound like science fiction. But it isn't. It's the Air Force's ongoing investment in what the future of warfare might look like. And then he became the commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory itself. Based out of Ohio, this is the central institution responsible for managing the Air Force's science and technology investment. The number attached to that role, the dollar figure associated with the programs he oversaw, was $4.4 billion annually. His workforce numbered nearly 11,000 people across multiple directorates, across multiple countries. Let that sit for a moment. 11,000 people for $0.4 billion. Programs so sensitive that even discussing their general outlines requires clearances that most Americans will never hold. This was not a figurehead position. This was not an honorary appointment. Richard Calloway was, for a significant stretch of time, one of the most consequential figures in American aerospace research. A man who knew, in substantial technical, operational detail, what the United States government was capable of building, testing, and deploying in the realm of advanced technology. And on a February morning in 2026, he vanished from a quiet residential street in Albuquerque. Now, to be fair, and it is important to be fair here, the authorities who responded to his disappearance did not treat this as a mysterious event. They issued a silver alert. A silver alert is designed for elderly or vulnerable adults who go missing, often due to cognitive or medical conditions. The implication in issuing one is not foul play. It is vulnerability. It is a concern that someone may be confused, disoriented, in need of medical help that they cannot ask for themselves. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office stated clearly that they were concerned for Calloway's safety due to medical issues. They did not specify what those medical issues were. They described the situation in language that was calm, procedural, and unremarkable. They called it a missing person situation. They asked the public to help. They set up a tip line. That is the official framing, and it is a reasonable one. Medical crises happen to people at 68 years old. Cognitive decline can come on suddenly, or it can creep up gradually, invisible to almost everyone until it isn't. Silver alerts exist because real people in real need disappear all the time, and most of those stories have explanations that, while sad, are not mysterious. But here's where it gets harder to hold the official framing, without noticing the places where it doesn't quite fit. Nobody knew what he was wearing. That is unusual, isn't it? This is a man who lived in a home, presumably with family or at least proximity to people who knew him. He was last seen at 11 in the morning, not at 4 a.m., not in the middle of the night, not at a time when no one would reasonably be expected to know where he was or what he had on. 11 a.m. is a normal, fully lit, mid-morning hour, and yet no one could say whether he had a coat on, whether he was in jeans or slacks, whether he was wearing shoes suited for walking or not. The direction of travel was also unknown. There was no vehicle description provided at all, which means authorities either did not know if he had taken a car or could not confirm it. For a search operation in a city, that distinction matters enormously. If he walked, he stayed within a certain radius. If he drove, he could be anywhere in the Southwest. At this point, investigators were left with two possibilities. Which one would you have believed? The first possibility is the one the silver alert implies. A man in declining health had a medical episode, became disoriented, and wandered away from a known area. It happens. It is, statistically speaking, the most likely explanation when an older person with medical issues goes missing without warning. The second possibility is harder to name, not because it involves any kind of conspiracy, but because it requires acknowledging that the particular man who disappeared was not an ordinary retired neighbor. He was a former commander of programs that most Americans will never read about in declassified documents, because those documents won't be declassified in any of our lifetimes. Within 2 days of the disappearance becoming public, the FBI's Albuquerque field office had joined the investigation. The sheriff's office confirmed this themselves. They were not vague about it. They specifically named the FBI as a coordinating partner. Now, to be scrupulously fair, it is not unusual for the FBI to assist in high-profile missing person cases, particularly those involving federal officials or former military personnel of significant rank. There's a protocol for that. But it is worth noting the pace at which that involvement was confirmed. Not weeks in, not after the local search had exhausted its resources. Within the first few days, the FBI was already there. Kirtland Air Force Base, the installation that Calloway had once helped lead, issued a formal statement through its current wing commander. The statement was brief. It said the base was coordinating closely with local authorities. It said that all updates would be deferred to the sheriff's office. It expressed concern for his family. That is a carefully composed statement. It says very little while covering exactly what it needs to cover. It does not say anything about what, if any, unique circumstances the base was aware of. It does not say anything about whether Calloway had been in contact with anyone at the base recently. It closes the door politely and steps back. What it does not do is explain why a current military installation would be coordinating with county sheriff's deputies on what the silver alert framing suggests is essentially a medical disappearance. Now, here is a name that will be unfamiliar to most people, but it matters. Tom Halden. Halden is not a government official. He is a private citizen who, over the past decade, has been involved in informal discussions with various retired military and intelligence figures about the subject of unacknowledged programs, a phrase used in oversight context to describe government activities that are not confirmed publicly. In 2016, documents obtained through a legal disclosure process revealed that Halden had been in contact with someone who appeared to match Calloway's description, referencing him specifically as a knowledgeable source on programs run out of laboratory at an Ohio Air Force facility. The details in those communications were not specific enough to confirm what exactly was being discussed. But the implication, the thing that researchers who follow this topic have noted for years, is that Calloway was regarded in certain circles as someone who knew things, specific things, things that had never been confirmed publicly, that had never been officially acknowledged, that the government had never opened to outside scrutiny. Calloway himself never commented on any of this publicly. He made no statements, gave no interviews, did not appear at conferences or forums on the subject. He was, until his disappearance, simply a retired general living quietly in New Mexico, a man who had served his country for 34 years and then gone home. That restraint, that silence, is either exactly what you would expect from a serious professional who took his oaths seriously and had no interest in speculation, or it is something else. It could be the restraint of a man who understood, with a precision most of us don't have, exactly what he was and was not permitted to say, and exactly what the consequences of saying the wrong thing might look like. That is not an accusation. That is an observation. There is a difference, and in a case like this, that difference matters. Let's stay with what is factual for a moment, because the factual picture is strange enough on its own without reaching for anything beyond it. A 68-year-old man with undisclosed medical issues was last seen at 11 o'clock in the morning on a Friday in a residential neighborhood in Albuquerque. Neither his clothing nor his direction of travel was known. No one came forward publicly in the first several days to say they had seen him. The New Mexico search and rescue team was brought in. The FBI joined the case. A sitting U.S. Congresswoman mentioned his name and background on social media, drawing attention to his former role specifically, not just his disappearance, but who he had been and what he had once overseen. The search went on. The updates thinned. The public-facing communications from the sheriff's office became more procedural and less specific as the days passed. This is a pattern that appears in missing person cases regularly, and it has two very different explanations. The first is operational. Law enforcement often goes quiet when they are actively pursuing leads they don't want to compromise. Silence can be a tool of investigation, not a sign of disengagement. The second is less reassuring. Cases go quiet when they stop generating leads worth pursuing, when the trail has genuinely gone cold, and when the resources available have been stretched to their limit without result. There is no way to know, from the outside, which of those explanations applies here. What can be said is that the people closest to the search were asking for very specific things from the public. They asked people to check home security cameras. They asked people to preserve original footage rather than trimming or editing it before submitting. They created a digital portal specifically for video submissions. That level of specificity in a public appeal usually indicates that investigators believe the answer lies somewhere in the ordinary footage of ordinary life. A camera over a garage, a doorbell camera on a porch, that captured something without knowing it captured something. That, in itself, suggests that the disappearance had a physical trajectory. That somewhere, at some point, Calloway was visible to a camera or a person. That he didn't simply cease to exist on a residential street. He went somewhere. The question, the one that remained open days into the search, was where and how, and why no one had yet found the image that answered it. There is also the question of who Richard Calloway was in the final chapter of his life. Not who he had been at the height of his career, not who he was in his official biography, but who he was at 68, living in Albuquerque, some distance removed from the centers of power he had once occupied. What did his days look like? What was he working on, if anything? Who did he see? What was on his mind? These are questions that the public record cannot answer, because those details belong to the people who knew him. But they are the questions that any honest reconstruction of this case eventually arrives at, because they are the questions that connect a man's past to his present and to the morning he disappeared. A person does not vanish in a vacuum, even in cases where the explanation is purely medical. A stroke, a sudden confusion, a moment of profound disorientation. The disappearance is still anchored to a life, a routine, a set of habits, a sequence of recent events that, taken together, might tell a story that isn't yet clear. And in cases where the explanation is something other than medical, those anchoring details matter even more. Who did he speak to in the days before? Did anything change in his behavior? Was he worried about something? Was he expecting something? Was he trying to reach someone? Or was someone trying to reach him? These are not accusations. They are the kinds of questions that investigators ask in every missing person case. And they're the kinds of questions that never get answered publicly because the answers, when they exist, belong first to the investigation and often never make it out. What we are left with, then, is this: a man with a remarkable and largely classified career disappeared on an ordinary February morning in a city he knew well, from a neighborhood that was familiar to him. The people responsible for finding him mobilized quickly, brought in federal assistance within days, and asked the public for very specific kinds of help. They said very little beyond that. The man's background, his connection to programs that do not appear in public budgets, his decades inside the architecture of American aerospace research, the references to him in documents that surfaced years before his disappearance, adds a layer of context that the official framing does not address. It doesn't have to. Law enforcement is not obligated to acknowledge what a missing person once knew or who once sought them out. But we are, as observers, entitled to hold both pictures at once. The official picture: a man in fragile health who wandered away and has not yet been found. And the other picture: a man who spent 34 years learning things that the rest of us are not permitted to know, who retired quietly, who said nothing publicly, and who then disappeared on a clear Friday morning, leaving behind no trace of where he went or why. What we know with certainty is small. He was last seen at 11 a.m. He was 68 years old. He had medical concerns that were not specified to public. His direction of travel and his clothing were unknown. He had not been found in the days that followed. What we don't know fills a much larger space. We don't know whether he left on his own or whether someone helped him leave. We don't know whether the medical framing tells the whole story or whether it tells only part of it. We don't know what the FBI's involvement has turned up, if anything. We don't know whether the surveillance footage that investigators were seeking ever materialized, or what it showed if it did. There's a version of this story where Richard Calloway is found, where the explanation is medical and human, and sad in the ordinary way that these situations are sad, and where none of the context about his career ends up matching at all. That version is not only possible, it is a version that the people closest to him almost certainly hope for. And then there's a version where the explanation, if it ever surfaces, is something else entirely, where the silence around this case isn't the silence of a medical search that is ongoing, but the silence of something that those in a position to explain it have no intention of explaining. The difference between those two versions may never be clear. Not to us, and perhaps not to anyone outside of a very small group of people who are not talking. What remains is the image of a quiet February morning, a familiar neighborhood, a man who knew things that most people will never have access to, stepping out of frame. 11 o'clock, cold and pale blue sky, and then nothing. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If you've been following this story, if you know anything about Richard Calloway or cases like his, or if you simply want to keep this conversation going, the comments are there. Use them. The worst thing that can happen to a case like this is the same thing that happens to all of them eventually. The world moves on, the questions go unasked, and whatever the answer was, it stays buried under everything else that comes next.